than 20 years. But it costs a lot. It costs a lot of resources, money to pay to all those soldiers. I mean, are they capable? No, probably they are, but...
Well, yes and no. They are going to run into real limitations in their abilities to sustain these kinds of operations indefinitely. And the fantastic team at ISW has been reporting on that, including in a great report by Christina Harward on Russia's vulnerabilities. They are running out of tanks. They are not going to be able to produce enough tanks to offset their losses. They are having challenges producing other kinds of military equipment. And those challenges are going to continue. Obviously, they have a lot of people, and they have more people than Ukraine does. But there are a couple of factors that are constraining their ability actually to bring that numerical advantage to bear. One is that they have to man their military industry as well as their army, and they're taking staggering losses on the front line, which is exacerbating difficulties that they're having doing both of those things. So they're having a labor shortage in Russia, which is impacting their ability to mobilize, and that in turn means that they will have problems maintaining manpower necessary for this kind of warfare indefinitely, particularly if Putin remains unwilling to order full-scale involuntary mobilization, which is something that he's shown himself very reluctant to do since the last time that he did that in 2022. He got something like 330,000 more soldiers into his army, and something like 700,000 Russians fled the country. From what we can tell, Russian enthusiasm for involuntarily fighting in this war is not higher now than it was then. So I think that Putin will continue to be reluctant to do that, and that will be a real check on his ability to continue doing this indefinitely.
But if to look on the current situation on the front line, I mean, is it more favorable to Ukraine or to Russia, or it's hard to say?
Well, the Russians have been conducting offensive operations uninterruptedly since basically January of 2024. And the Ukrainians have managed basically to stop them from taking almost any settlement of significance outside of Avdiivka, which they took at the start of that series of offensives. In 2024, the Russians lost close to 500,000 soldiers for an area that in the US we say is about 9/10 the size of the state of Rhode Island, which is one of our smallest states. It's a bit larger than Luxembourg. That's a huge success for Ukraine. It doesn't feel like a success because it's Ukrainian forces on the defensive, and they've been slowly losing ground, and losing ground is losing ground. And I don't want to present this as a wonderful thing because it isn't. But it is a success in that the Russians have thrown everything that they've had at an effort to take the city of Pokrovsk, to take all of Donetsk Oblast, to take Chasiv Yar, to take Konstantinivka, and they haven't taken any of those. And they've had to settle for grinding fights that net them fields and small villages. And again, every hectare that's lost to Ukraine is a tragedy, and every village that's lost is a tragedy. But when you look at the scale of losses that Ukrainians have inflicted on the Russians for the very limited gains the Russians have made, and when you look at the fact that Ukrainian forces have prevented the Russians from achieving any of their major military objectives over the past year and a half, it's quite an accomplishment for Ukraine. And it is part of what Ukraine will need to do in order to get Putin to understand that he's not going to be able to conquer Ukraine militarily, and he's going to have to change the way that he thinks about this war.
Well, I hope for that. But, many experts say this war has become not just a drone war, but a logistic war. When supplies change, repair lines and ammunition stocks matter more than slogans. Do you agree that logistics are now the key to victory? Or is that something serious right now?
Well, logistics are always part of the key to victory. This is always an essential component of war. It's an often overlooked component of war. People get fixated on flashy technology and on battlefield advances. But if you don't have a solid supply chain, if you don't have a solid logistics system, then you won't be able to fight. Ukraine has done an amazing job of creating a complex and resilient supply chain, and of increasingly limiting its dependence on single sources of supply, and particularly the United States. When we looked at the situation when the U.S. aid was suspended from 2023 into 2024, and we looked at how devastating the effects of that suspension were on Ukraine's ability to fight, and we compare that to the situation now, we see that Ukraine and its particularly European and to some extent its Asian friends and partners have really managed to diversify their sources of supply in a way that has made them a lot less dependent on the United States as a sole essential provider. And I think the other dynamic that we're seeing, which is very positive, is that the Europeans are increasingly realizing that they have a lot of skin in this game, and they are going to have to continue to step up and help Ukraine as a way of helping themselves. And I think that that's a very promising start, and I hope that over the course of this summer and through this year, we will see that impulse solidified into a real long-term commitment backed by meaningful investments in European preparations to help Ukraine sustain its supply chain and its logistics.
But are we good in destroying Russian supply chains? I mean, somehow to, interrupt all that?
It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to disrupt the supply chains of a large state, and Russia is a huge state. Ukrainian forces have been extremely good at finding very creative ways to take advantage of Russian mistakes, sometimes blowing up massive Russian ammunition depots, and at other times driving Russian forces away from airfields that they need, and so on. I think that it's given the capabilities that Ukraine actually has and is likely to be able to have, Ukraine is doing as good a job as it can. But at the end of the day, it's really for the international community to continue to bring pressure and ideally increase the pressure on the other countries like Iran and North Korea and China that are helping Russia and giving Russia access to their military industries, and in some cases, in the case of the Iranians and the North Koreans in particular, of course, actually just giving the Russians lots of weapons to get that to stop. That's not something Ukraine can do, and it will be very hard for the world to do. But I think the world could be doing more.
Yes. Andrius Kubilius, the first ever European Commissioner for Defense and Space, he was recently in Kyiv on defense conference, security conference, and he told to Ukrainian journalists that there is less and less weaponry in the world that Ukraine would not be able to produce on its own, even air defense system. What is your take on that?
Ukraine has done an amazing job. I mean, let's start by remembering, I don't need to remind you, and I don't need to remind my Ukrainian friends, but the world needs to remember that Ukraine had a major defense industry before the full-scale invasion. It had a basis on which to build. It was a significant arms exporter. And of course, Kyiv was the heart of the Soviet aerospace industry. And Ukraine has done an amazing job of developing defense industry, military industry during the war, and developing the ability to produce a lot of the weapons that it had been receiving from the West. I think it's going to be very important for Ukraine and for Europe to continue to work on co-investment, European investment in Ukrainian defense industry. And that's probably going to require some challenging changes for Ukraine as well to ensure that Europeans benefit from that, especially over the long term as well. I think Ukraine ultimately can become one of the arsenals of freedom, working with European investors and European defense industry in this way. That said, I think there are some systems that Ukraine will have a very hard time replicating anytime soon. Systems like the Patriot that are able to intercept ballistic missiles are extremely difficult to develop. I would love to see an indigenous Ukrainian version of that, but
difficult. Difficult. But is that possible? Even, let's imagine, in 5 or 10 years.
I can't give a timeline on it. The fact that we developed it means that it can be developed, and so I think with sufficient investment, and particularly in conjunction with European and Asian partners, I'm certain that it can be replicated, but I have no idea in what time or at what cost.
Yeah. I often hear that Russia isn't just avoiding a ceasefire because it still plans to conquer Ukraine, but also